So for almost 10 years, while I was already working as a healer, somatic therapist, and consultant in leadership and organizational development, I came down with a debilitating chronic illness that included Lyme disease, all the associated co-infections of Babesia, Bartonella, Borrelia, mercury poisoning in my brain, leaky gut, parasites, all of which made it impossible to think, at times even to speak. And of course, it brought with it an unending, crippling fatigue. Now, for 3 years at the beginning of that journey, I chased my symptoms, followed what conventional medicine told me, all to no avail, until as a longtime psychosomatic healer, I finally realized something, that my body had become such a hellscape that I was doing everything in my power to avoid it, literally exiling my awareness from it. And in that moment, I realized that I was running, when really what was needed for me to do was to bring my awareness back into my body, back into my pain, and to what it was trying to tell me. And what I discovered not only changed the way that I approached healing radically, dramatically, completely, but the way I approached life. Because what I found was something I had previously understood only intellectually, that the psyche is made up of a multiplicity of parts, like an energetic matrix, and that over time will begin to war with itself as a result of trauma if we're not careful, if we don't heal. This is when one part of you says, I'm going in this direction, and another, usually smaller, quieter part says, that's going to hurt me. And if you keep going without getting me on board, I'm going to tell you that it's hurting me in the only way I know how, by developing symptoms. And these symptoms will first lightly tap on the door of your awareness. And if you don't listen, they'll start leaning on the doorbell. And if you still don't listen, they'll have no choice but to drive a tank right through the living room wall just to get your attention. And so what I eventually discovered was that chronic illness is a process that the unconscious, the capital S self, you could even say, uses to motivate us into evolving and transforming our lives in very specific ways. And it's that understanding and aligning to that understanding that is what ultimately healed me. And soon after that, I was invited to serve at the in-house psychosomatic specialist for the inimitable and amazing Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt at Sophia Health Institute, where I served as part of just an incredible team of gifted naturopaths and adjunctive practitioners helping patients to heal from the very same chronic illness that I had suffered from only a few years prior. And my role in that was to share what I'm sharing with you now, a process of helping to illuminate the deeper intrapsychic, traumatic, familial, ancestral, epigenetic roots of chronic illness that I now, deeply believe invite us all to undergo a transformative hero's journey. And that if we accept and align to, really accelerates the path of healing dramatically. And for the record, one of the biggest trends that I've now seen after 15 years working professionally in the chronic illness domain is that it disproportionately impacts empaths, who are also overgivers, usually with poor boundaries, and who often fall into the scapegoat archetype within their family system and relational system. And so I think we need to really recontextualize how we're seeing chronic illness, autoimmune dysfunctions, Lyme disease, the whole epidemic of chronic and complex conditions, not just as a viral or toxic environmental issue, even though it also is, but as a much deeper transformation that the body mind is trying to usher the individual through, but that if we don't understand, we will usually end up resisting. And, since I've begun to really understand this, I've now also begun to see the breakdown of multiple systems all over the world through a similar lens. that this global meta crisis that we're all within and watching is really also just the net result of a collective chronic illness and psychospiritual dysfunction that began thousands of years ago and that has been hinted at in some of our greatest myths and parables, and that perhaps could be described most simply as a fragmented ego's struggle to find homeostasis within the larger system of the self. Archetypally, this story is as old as the hills. In Greek mythology, it's the all-consuming and self-terminating egotism of the Titans, as well as the Olympians that revolted against them, and the first humans that came after both of them. It's the despotism and fate of Sisyphus, arguably the poster boy for modern hyperconsumerism. It's Agent Smith in The Matrix, right? An endlessly replicating cancerous toxicity that wants to completely colonize the earth. It's also the nothing in the never-ending story. It's Goethe's Faustian bargain. It's Wagner's Ring of Power. It's Tolkien's Precious. It's Beowulf. It's the Khan. It's the Bomb. All archetypal symbols and narratives that we are all living out, and that perhaps no more intimately and viscerally are experienced than in the perfect storm of chronic illness. Because if one thing becomes clear over the course of a prolonged and unremitting sickness, is how it very clearly becomes our own personal micro-reflection of the global meta-crisis internally. As the illness goes on, and hopefully the healing journey begins, it often begins to dawn on us how we too have not been embracing the multiplicity of our inner world in appropriately equitable and holistic ways, just like the institutions of society writ large. Slowly, you too may become mindful of how excessively identified you are with your own internal 1%, an overly dominant aspect, unwilling to acknowledge the other internal parts of your psyche that include this subterranean orphanage of traumatized exile parts and inner children, all calling out to be healed. Prior to the kind of illness that goes on for years and for which only a complete systems reboot will really suffice to heal, you will often be wholly unwilling to face what your body and mind are actually complaining about. Usually you won't even care. And I say this because I certainly didn't. Because we all have things to do, don't we? Missions to accomplish. And we're going to accomplish them, by Jove, come hell or high water, whether our traumas or our energetic heart like it or not. Because we alone have the power and it's all up to us. And if we don't do it, then no one else will, or whatever rationalization floats your particular boat at the time. And in so doing, you will ignore, like I did for a time, the unmetabolized vulnerability in your solar plexus that compromises your rest and digest, the fear in your kidneys that undermines your adrenal function, the rage stuck in your throat that blocks your thyroid. Because to actually face it would mean to look those traumatized parts that are attempting to cross the border, you could say, from your unconscious mind into your conscious, directly in the eyes, and to let the full force of their suffering make contact with you, instead of dissociating from it with suppression, compartmentalization, and the building of a wall, we could say, between our own vast network of traumas hiding just between our conscious and conscious minds and just under the surface of our fragile ego, which is usually floating quite precariously on top. We want so desperately to leave the past in the past because it makes no sense to us to begin rehashing old wounds that we feel we either had nothing to do with or that we were too young to be a part of. And in so doing, we will forget that to the body and psyche, there is no past, and that the past is right here in the present, inside us all, and superimposed over our senses like negatively interfacing distortion fields that make it almost impossible for us to see one another clearly, let alone ourselves. And so, as a result, chronic illness often serves as a transitional opportunity when the sheer burden of unconsciousness has hit its limit, and all the pain that we've been resisting and repressing or projecting onto others, and often for generations, begins to spill out into physical symptoms until one day we wake up and a revolution has taken place in our bodies. Suddenly, our brain goes on strike like a government shutdown. Our lymphatic system becomes clogged like protesters stopping traffic. Our memory and language skills break down like the decline of public discourse, as every conceivable system within us says no to business as usual. And through this, we are invited to finally take that archetypal hero's journey into the back room where we've hidden our own version of Dorian's portrait, and into the untamed forest behind it, to the place beyond the pale, to the island of the lepers, to the land of the meek, to the labyrinth that holds the minotaur, to the mine that holds the Balrog, to the ocean where lives the Leviathan, into Hades, Valhalla, the Inferno. And as the dark night draws from our lips the old words, "Why have you forsaken me?" a curtain will often be pulled back to reveal not a monster or a dragon, but a child longing for reintegration. This is what is behind door number one of that archetypal journey of chronic illness. And we can take that door, or we can continue to avoid our wounds by projecting them onto others or repressing them, just like any industry that secretly dumps toxic waste into a city water supply, or siphons debt onto a public tax burden, or deforests an indigenous population to avoid facing the actual challenge of the part finding homeostatic balance within the whole. And that process, incidentally, of projection and repression is arguably the first pollution, the belief that if we can just avoid them or fix them or exterminate them, it'll be better for all of us, the rest of us. And it's a highly sophisticated and, frankly, a delusional sleight of hand, a psychological sleight of hand that even nonprofits and charities and advocacy groups and revolutions that otherwise may be good and true and right become contaminated with. And Leo Tolstoy knew it and said, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself." And Emerson knew it and also said, "All men plume themselves on the improvement of society, while no man improves." And Henry David Thoreau knew it and said, "Things don't change, men do." But we're apparently still learning that, not just in culture at large, but in our own bodies, in our own homes and hearts. All of which brings us back to the archetypal journey, which, if explored through, let's say, Greek mythology, begins with a confrontation of the guardian of the unconscious, the multi-headed dog Cerberus, that barks an endless mental stream of rationalizations for why you should not enter your pain, why you should not enter your unconscious, why you should avoid it at all costs, or even bear it indefinitely because you deserve to. You deserve nothing better, as an initial stage that always ends, hopefully, with an understanding of the fundamental limitations of thought. And that not only can we not necessarily believe everything we think, but that much of what we think actually we don't even believe and isn't even true. Which then leads us into the somatic realm, depicted perhaps best by the rivers of Hades and the boatman of the underworld, Charon, who I used to think of as a kind of, Venetian gondolier, but who's probably more like Laird Hamilton navigating a 100-year storm. With Charon, and also with Hermes, we could say, we're invited to learn an emotional and somatic literacy and fluency, which cannot simply be done with the mind, because to try to feel with the mind is like trying to clean out the basement by vacuuming your attic. And indeed, it's no coincidence that the Greek underworld has rivers, and that Charon, and Hermes too, takes you in a boat to visit the underworld where your traumas reside, rather than, let's say, in a chariot or on the shoulders of a griffin. It's important that it's a boat because we have to learn to swim in these emotionally deep waters. And to also bear in mind that too much too soon can risk capsizing us. Edward Edinger, the great Jungian analyst, speaks of this phenomenon quite beautifully when he says that it's helpful to liken the ego to a fishing boat that can only take on a certain amount of fish. Fish, of course, being, the great symbol of the Christ pre-Christ. It's the part of us that goes under the water. It's also related to, the bishop's hat. It's that part of us that, understands those deeper realms. We can only go in and take on no more than we can hold. The load must be commensurate with its size, which means that if you're fishing in a small rowboat and you catch a whale, Edinger says, be careful as you pull it in because you might go under. On the other hand, we must also make sure not to go too far in the other direction, because as Edinger also reminds us, it's often more dangerous to avoid facing the white whale of the self than to confront it, because in trying to avoid it, it will often get you from behind, which I've often seen manifested in chronic illness, even in heart disease, ALS, a lot of conditions. I've seen them as the symptoms that rise up because we're not paying attention, sadly. The illness is always a messenger. And so there's really no escape, I think, from the archetypal hero's journey, and really only a preparation for the next inevitable moment in which we will be called to face it. So if you're going through chronic illness and looking for support, well, feel free to reach out or simply check out the referrals page on my website. And otherwise, good luck. It's not an easy journey, but as I said before, I went on my own for 10 years, so I have a lot of compassion for anyone who's trying to navigate it. And I'll keep offering whatever wisdom I have to those to whom it benefits. Thanks for listening. Peace in.